You're listening to the Roovolution podcast. Join us as we bust myths and challenge common assumptions, helping you to revolutionize your rooster experience. So today we wanted to talk about something that we see pretty regularly in the, chicken keeper communities, and that is the two main labels that individuals seem to put on chickens, and that is they're either livestock or they're pets. And we want to kind of get into sort of the dynamic between the two, the interaction between the two types of keepers, and how that affects the type of advice that's given and the type of care that's provided for the birds.
Yeah, this one absolutely drives me nuts because invariably when you see people who are treating their chickens more as pets post any question, any concern that they might have, if they show even a little bit, of worry or attachment or desire, to really go above and beyond for that animal, the livestock community seems to immediately jump in and ridicule, reprimand, accuse them of being absurd and suggest that they're going to harm their birds with this mindset. There's just a really pervasive idea that chickens are not pets. They are livestock, period, end of story. And for whatever reason, this just really tends to lead conversations to deteriorate. It's like nobody can meet in the middle and nobody can see from any different perspective here.
Well, I don't think either party is actually considering the perspective of the other party.
Right.
The livestock keepers just have that mindset, and that's the thing that they think is right. And if somebody's coming at it from a different angle, then they're not even necessarily questioning the perspective of the person that's giving them the advice that might go against their intuition or their feelings.
Or their values or their goals. Yeah. Well, and on one hand, I can kind of understand where this is coming from because, for thousands of years, chickens have been regarded as just a resource. It's really pretty recently that they even entered into the pet sphere. That's a pretty new development. So I think something that's coming into play here is just this idea that because this has always been the perspective, that makes it the correct perspective or the only correct perspective. But if you really take a step back and try to analyze this and identify what criteria might there be that would limit chickens to being only livestock. Because of course when we got our flocks, we were not coming at it from a pet approach. We weren't expecting them really to be pets because we, like so many others, had been told that these are livestock. We're not going to have a relationship with them. They're going to be in our yard. We'll feed and water them, collect eggs. And that's about it.
Well, that sort of seems to be the criteria. It's not necessarily a criteria that the animal has to meet, but it's like a criteria that a person sets for themselves, and it can apply to any animal. If you just decide that, you're going to, use an animal as a resource and benefit from them, then it comes with the territory that you don't try to develop a bond. I don't even see anybody, well, that's not true. I don't see too many people even suggesting or, going out of their way to suggest that they're not capable. It's more of a stance of like, why would you even try? It's not worth the time. You're going to eat them anyway.
Well, even in the cases where people aren't going to eat them and have made that completely clear, there's still kind of this vibe of ridicule, that these are not animals that are supposed to be pets. They're simplistic, they're limited, they don't appreciate human affection or companionship, which of course we've seen proven to be absolutely ridiculous in our experiences. I would go so far as to say the chickens have been the best suited companion animal that I've personally ever had around.
Definitely.
And you take examples like dogs, for instance. In our culture, dogs are very firmly in the pet category. Right, but you look to certain other cultures and they are livestock too, so it's really hard not to ask the question, what's actually driving these labels? Is it anything about the animal themselves or is it something else?
It seems to be tradition.
It seems to be really heavily tied to tradition. It also seems to be very heavily tied to what we value from them. So if historically we've only valued that resource, what they can provide to us, and haven't personally, really thought far beyond that or opened ourselves up to anything beyond that, then that's where they're going to remain. But when you really get into this, you start looking into, for instance, archaeological finds. Just recently, they discovered a grave site that contained the remains of chickens with zero evidence of butchering. So even though the perception here is that chickens and humans have always had this relationship of use and consumption, there's even older evidence to suggest that before that, they were given the same kinds of burial rites as humans. They were living out their natural lives with no evidence of having been killed, dying natural deaths, and being buried alongside human remains. So it seems that a very long time back, our perspective on this was completely different. And yet you go long enough sort of in this tunnel vision mindset, and it's easy to feel like there's no room for any new approach. So this is what gets me, when I see these new keepers coming in with questions, and especially with a lot of the new keepers, they're coming from a perspective where they've never really kept livestock before. These aren't your generational, farm types who were raised with this.
Yeah, especially since the COVID pandemic and everybody started working from home. These were office workers that, they're not working on a farm, they're not raising livestock. And, in an attempt to be a little more self-sufficient, they decided, well, I'm working from home now. We'll have some chickens and get some eggs for ourselves. And,
right.
And I think those people are probably much more likely to be, predisposed to see them as pets.
Right, exactly. Well, and they're coming into it with a pet mindset already because that's what they're familiar with. So, this is really all that's going on is we're looking at the same thing, but we're seeing something completely different because of the framework we're working from. And we're going to find what we look for. So when you're going into this looking for a dumb, simplistic, limited bird that isn't really good for anything but, food source, you're going to find that. But if you do happen, to go into it expecting more or prepared to see more.
Just even open to the possibility of more.
Really, exactly. Just open to it. It's like this entire thing just expands like you wouldn't believe. And you wind up seeing the evidence that these are incredibly social, incredibly affectionate, incredibly intelligent animals that are just as well equipped to be regarded as a pet or a companion as anything else.
Yeah, totally. Just based on our own personal experience, I definitely think they're more, not necessarily conscious, but they're definitely more intelligent or capable of, comprehending and analyzing things than, our dog or our cats. And studies have long found that they're as smart as a 4-year-old human, and the more recent ones suggest that they're as smart as a 7-year-old.
Right, because they've just recently been confirmed to be capable of transitive inference, which doesn't develop in humans until 7 years old. So there's a push now to adjust that estimate upward to account for that. And it's worth noting, too, that even at the 4 years old estimate that's widely agreed on, that still places them in a category of being more intelligent than either cats or dogs. So, you really start to break this down and you start to ask yourself, well, what is it? What is it that makes an animal an acceptable pet? What would make this animal not qualify to be viewed that way? And obviously it's not intelligence. They're more intelligent than the animals that we regularly keep as pets already. It wouldn't be their ability to be in a social kind of relationship or bond. They're social animals. They're flock animals. We keep all kinds of birds that have a very similar dynamic. It might be that they're very messy. I hear that brought up, that because of how much they poop and the dirt and everything, that they're not something you want to get close to. But what's interesting about that is that all birds poop that much. If you've ever kept any kind of parrots, this is a bird thing. This isn't a chicken thing. They also make diapers, for chickens. So if we take these most extreme examples of, like we currently have a hen living in the house as of about 4 months ago. It's as a side effect of illness in her case, but she has adapted like crazy to being indoors. There's been no issues with illness on our part, really not even issues with dust, because she spends the vast majority of her time in the house. She's not bringing in dirt. Hoops aren't any more of an issue than they would be with any other bird. And she's gotten all kinds of opportunities to learn some really incredible things. These days, she steps up on command. She's learned that she can climb onto our arm when we offer it to go where she wants to go. So even without a prompt, we can literally just hold out our arm. You know, if we say step up, she'll step up. Oftentimes just holding out the arm is all it takes, and she gets the message and up she goes. She'll also run up to us as we put our shoes on to go outside, just like a little dog. She knows what that means.
Yeah, and in addition to, you know, being able to adapt to new routines and new habits, you know, they're remarkably affectionate. You know, the roosters and the hens, you know, once that bond is developed and once you've gained their trust, like you would expect in a pet animal, they are super affectionate.
Incredibly so. I mean, we always joke, right, that they live on our lap and would if we'd allow them to. I don't know if the roosters would ever get down, honestly, if we didn't compel them to. But that's something I absolutely wasn't prepared for going into it. And I imagine quite a lot of new keepers, you know, if they do allow themselves to get close, if they do open themselves up to that possibility, they find the same thing. And so, you know, coming back to the concern here and why this matters, because obviously they also can fall into the livestock category, and a great many people keep them for that purpose. Where the issue is the suggestion that it's wrong or irrational to view them otherwise. And what can often happen is that these new keepers who actually are on the right track, just a different track, wind up reprimanded and scared out of doing things that are far more in line with their goal.
Shamed into doing something different.
Exactly. Because they're told that they're doing it wrong. And a lot of people, you know, there's this appeal to authority going on. You come into these new groups and communities and you see these people who've been keeping chickens, their family's been keeping chickens for, you know, decades, maybe centuries even.
And on top of that, the sheer number of them, you know, in the larger groups on, you know, on Facebook in particular, like, you know, there's 500,000 members, and the vast majority of those people are keeping chickens as livestock.
Right. Well, and they make a fairly reasonable assumption that those people know what they're doing. Being someone who's very familiar with something and has been doing it for a long time obviously is not proof that they're doing it right. Right? You can do the wrong thing for a really, really long time. So that alone isn't enough to back up what's being said, but it's reasonable to expect that they probably are experienced and they probably aren't providing incorrect information, but they could be providing inappropriate information. And they often are. And I don't really see a lot of people questioning that. I don't even see a lot of people making any effort to confirm that we're coming from the same place here, you know.
Well, and, you know, so they're giving that information. Again, they view the chickens as livestock, so they're not expecting to get a full lifespan out of that bird, or, you know, to give that bird a full lifespan. And it's just unfortunate that the people that are coming at this with more of a pet mindset, and they're asking these questions, aren't digging any deeper. Like you said, you know, they're just accepting what the majority rule says.
Well, I mean, this is an animal that's been kept for quite a long time. It's easy to get into it, assuming that there's just one right answer, and trusting those authority figures within the community to have it and provide it. And this is why it's so important to break this down and figure out what is it we're actually dealing with here. Because everything is going to differ based on that answer. If you have chickens as a pet animal, you're not doing it wrong. I mean, you could be just as easily as the livestock keepers could be, but you're not doing it wrong simply by regarding them that way. That's perfectly called for and appropriate. But it's going to drive what standard of care you're providing. It's going to drive the lengths you're willing to go to tend to them and keep them healthy. You know, a livestock keeper is not going to take a sick layer into the vet for blood work and labs and x-rays. It wouldn't be financially sensible to do it. And everyone understands that. That's just logical. But the pet keepers aren't coming from this logical place. They're coming from an emotional place, understandably so. So it becomes a bit like, the example that I like to give people is like when you determine that a car is totaled. If a car has been damaged to the extent that it would cost more to replace it than to fix it, the logical thing to do is to buy a new car, obviously. But if that's your first car, if it has sentimental value for some reason, if it's an art piece that you've put a bunch of work into, that modifies things.
Or if it's a dog or a cat or a commonly accepted pet animal, no one bats an eye at spending hundreds or even thousands of dollars on vet bills.
Well, and this is the thing, is that it might look like we're not following, this value calculation, but we are actually. It's just that the value isn't a financial one at that point. What is valuable to the livestock keeper is often going to be returns, profits, these kinds of things. What's valuable to the pet keeper is going to be the individual, the relationship, and the emotion they have for them. So you're going to get into a situation very quickly where that $2 bird is well worth spending $2,000 on to treat and to support and to care for. So when you go into these communities and you find a pet keeper asking, what do I do? This bird is acting lethargic and limping. And everyone is so quick to jump to saying, oh, well, just put them in a kennel overnight and try to give some electrolyte water and see how they do. Okay, that may be fine if you're fine with potentially losing that bird. This person might be regarding them as the family dog.
Well, and I think, part of the issue is that, the pet keepers that go onto these groups and ask these questions aren't designating themselves as a pet keeper. They're not letting the group know that, this is the kind of information I want, out of this.
Right. Occasionally they are. I will see people post and say, culling isn't an option, for instance. And oftentimes they'll be argued with and they'll be told why it should be. But, especially, when it comes to the more mild advice, I think it honestly doesn't cross people's mind that because of the history we have with chickens and because of the category we've placed them in, people aren't all going to be on the same track. You go to a dog forum and you ask for information or advice on something you're dealing with, and you can rest assured that everyone in that community is coming from pretty much the same perspective. But these people love their birds so much and they've become so attached to them, they make a kind of charming and innocent mistake of expecting everyone they're interacting with to have that same view and to see what they're seeing and to care the way they care. And of course, it deteriorates very quickly when this happens. The pet keepers wind up accusing the livestock keepers of being heartless and evil and all of these things. And the livestock keepers respond by accusing the pet keeper of being unrealistic and sensitive and overthinking things they should just let go. Especially when it comes to what's required to care correctly for these animals.
Yeah. Again, because the livestock keeper is not trying to get 12 years out of their birds. They're happy with 2 or 3. And,
right.
Medications and various treatments that might have long-term effects, the livestock keeper's never seen that. So even in their experience, when they say, I've been using this for decades and I've never had a problem, well, they've never had a problem in the 2 years that their bird is alive.
Yeah, well, there's a really flippant approach to a lot of it, and even the products that are designed for them aren't being designed with the same concern or consideration in mind. The manufacturers of all of these goods and products and medications know that when they're selling these for cats and dogs, they need to be safe, they need to be effective, they need to be high quality and reliable. But when it comes to chickens, there's just really a lot of gaps out there. Inability to even get the correct products. People don't often consider that the treatment that they're being suggested to use may be one that has not been tested ever, that we don't know a single thing about. Blue coat comes to mind, which is sort of the Band-Aid approach, to injury. Instead of pulling that member from the flock and treating them directly and separating, we just try to kind of dye them and call it good and put them back out there, hope for the best. And it may work a lot of the time, but it's been on the market for I don't even know how many years, and only just within the last few has it been found to be carcinogenic. And some people, when you bring this up, a lot of keepers aren't concerned. Well, I've used it before and I've never seen any ill effect. But the pet keepers are always incredibly grateful to know this because we don't want to take any chances. individual physiology differs, the length of use, the quantity used, all of these things are going to factor in. And so my advice to people is always, if you're going to take this input, make your verification, make your research into it of the level that reflects your attachment to this animal. How okay are you with potentially losing them? And that should guide, your skepticism, that should guide your commitment to not taking these risks and to finding the best possible option that keeps them safe.
Yeah. And just a little aside there, we can assure you that when you Google something, the first thing that pops up is not necessarily the right answer.
No, oh my gosh, I have to dig all the time. There's like 15 different articles to find one that not only is asking the right questions, but can support their answers that they're giving. It's just really a mess. And it does come back down to the fact that this stuff isn't being thought about. It's not being studied. Up until recently, nobody cared.
Yeah, even on the the veterinary side of things, some of the vets we've talked to know that a chicken has a faster metabolism than, some animals, and they know that the dosage of medication needs to be increased, but, specific medications might have a different different interaction,
right.
and be absorbed or utilized differently, and their dose shouldn't be multiplied because of that.
Yeah, there's only the one that I know of with the meloxicam. They're highly sensitive to it, and it's one of the only drugs that I've come across that shouldn't be overdosed for poultry specifically. But just all of these considerations, and it drives me nuts, the hand waving that goes on of just, oh, they'll be fine, they'll recover. Even when it comes to something simple like an injury, it's so reckless and it's so harmful to tell people who care deeply about making their animal and their care as comfortable and as supported as possible when they have something like, for example, a broken spur. Yeah, maybe they can just be stuck back out in the coop that night as long as bleeding has stopped. But are there things that can be done to be considerate, to make that experience a bit less miserable for them? Are they things that person would like to do? And if they are, why is nobody giving them?
Mm.
And why
even
are the people who give them ridiculed?
Yeah, even something as simple as, the antibiotic or antimicrobial, spray.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a simple thing that a lot of people don't do because, it's just a livestock animal.
Right.
It also makes me think of the little examples, that we see with our birds that could have turned into much worse things. Just the other day, there was a little speck of something on Morgan's eyelid. And, I thought it was just, like a crumb of food or maybe a piece of feather casing. And it was so small, like the, head of a pen. And he let me help him with it. I was, getting at it with my fingernail. And by the time I got a hold of it and pulled on it, it wound up being an entire feather that was probably a good, 2 inches long that was behind his eyeball. And like, oh my gosh, like that could have gotten infected. That could have turned into an abscess. That could have become a much bigger problem. And
Easily.
It's like, there's so many things like that.
Well, and the frustrating thing is that there's this disconnect there. That if we were to go on any of these broader communities and say, hey, does anyone else make a point to check their rooster's eyes and nostrils and mouth on a regular basis? We would be laughed out of the room. Mm-hmm. And the explanation for this would be chickens have survived for thousands of years without us. They're fine. But the problem is that's actually really completely untrue. They have survived in the wild without us for thousands of years. Well, wild chickens.
They've survived as a species, and just like any species, some live longer than others. Some get eaten by predators, before they've lived a full life. Some died due to illness before they've lived their full life.
Right. Even within the wild population, and sure, they don't need human intervention in the environment that they are meant to be in without any of the modifications to their physiology that we've introduced since bringing them to every corner of the globe. But even apart from that, there are going to be those individuals who have a pretty awful outcome as a result of being wild. So if what we're aiming to replicate is this wild environment, that brings with it a risk of loss, a risk of illness, a risk of injury, a very real one. And for a livestock keeper, that might be perfectly fine. It might even be the most practical way to go about it. But pet keepers don't follow this model, and for good reason.
I would even go as far as to say that for a livestock keeper to even suggest that we should treat them more like wild animals, that we should be more hands-off and, let them live their life as they would, it's kind of hypocritical because the birds were brought onto that property by the human. They were forced to live in, a coop, a man-made structure. Maybe they live in an enclosed run, or maybe they get to free range, but it's still not their natural habitat. It's not their natural environment. They're having to adapt to so many things that they wouldn't have to adapt to in nature. They come from the subtropics in South Asia.
Right. Yeah, and it's a completely different climate in most places that they're living, and that's before you even get into the modifications that have been done to these breeds. Mm-hmm. The single comb is there to assist with cooling, and it is not vulnerable to frostbite in the wild because there is not risk of frostbite in their natural habitat. Ever since we brought them into incredibly cold places with sub-zero temperatures, that has become a danger that a responsible keeper does absolutely have to do something to prevent. The same goes for shelter and cover. The wild chickens are not just grazing in pastures. They've got dense jungle canopies to protect them from predators and afford them hiding places. You can't just take these birds and just dump them out into a wide open yard, not accounting for breed, plumage, comb type, all of these things, and expect them to just be totally fine.
Because they're honestly entirely different than what people are saying, their wild comparative is. Their ancestors, the closest thing to them that ever lived in the wild, is the red jungle fowl. It's close to a game fowl. These laying hens and their rooster counterparts that we see are selectively bred over generations, and they're nothing like, they're really nothing like the game fowl, the red jungle fowl that they descend from.
They are actually domesticated, so this argument, it would be like suggesting that a Pomeranian doesn't need a human because wolves haven't needed them.
Right.
We are not talking about the same thing here. With our domestic chickens, they might physically resemble their wild counterparts more than a Pomeranian does, but there are marked differences, and then you talk about breeds like frizzles that can't even insulate because of that feather formation that we've bred into them. If someone gets on there and says, hey, I'm worried about my flock over winter, what can I do to prevent them from getting too cold? And again, nobody asks, well, where do you live? What breeds are you keeping? What's your setup like? Everyone just comes along with this hand waving, they'll be fine. Chickens have survived without humans for thousands of years. So this is something I'm harping on in these communities all the time, is that you cannot give this kind of advice without knowing those details. And to the pet keepers, harping on the fact that chickens are still chickens. And they do need certain things done differently than a human would prefer. So just because we like something or we would appreciate it does not necessarily mean that it's healthy or safe for them. You see people giving their chickens birthday cake, and it's probably not going to kill them, but we have to be so careful to recognize that this box that we put them in, whether livestock or pet, is going to tempt us into putting our own assumptions, our own framework, limiting their potential by what we're able to see in them in really insidious ways.
And it makes me think, if you step outside of those two boxes with most other animals on this planet, you could still consider them to be either a pet or a livestock, but there's a third consideration, and it's that they're wild animals. We've seen some videos actually of a guy who has a pet crocodile, and it's super cuddly and tame, and he takes it to people, and it's like a therapy animal. And most people would not look at that and think it could even possibly be a pet, that it could fall into the pet category. And to an extent, you might be right in the way that you perceive it and the way that you treat it and the way that you care for it really goes more towards treating a wild animal. You respect it as a wild animal. You allow it to, have its natural behaviors as it would as a wild animal. And you set up its environment like it would have in nature. And that's sort of a perspective that allows for a better care for the animal, whether you view it as livestock or pet, in your personal opinion, the way that you care for it, you should be considering it, in its natural habitat. And if there's anything different there, you need to adjust.
Right, exactly. And so it's kind of like they're in this weird middle ground where you can have this pet relationship with them, and you're not wrong in doing so, but they're not quite as maybe accustomed to the human lifestyle, as your dog or your cat might be. For instance, I would have a very hard time keeping a house chicken without giving them an opportunity to dust bathe. I have seen people who have dust bathing stations in their house for their house chickens. I don't know if I could do that. I'd probably be taking them out for yard time each day. But how is this really any different than what you do for dogs? It's this argument so often seems to come down to the suggestion that chickens don't belong in the house, which I will grant that. But I would also ask, what animal does?
Yeah.
Can you
I don't
think of
think
a
there's
single
one.
No.
And as pet keepers ourselves, we've kind of made we've been on a long journey and learned a lot and gone from, what you might think of as a pretty typical pet keeper to thinking a little bit differently and viewing all animals as wild animals that, at least in the chicken's case or our pet's case, we have forced into an unnatural situation. And the best way that we can care for them is to respect them as though they were a wild animal.
Right. I mean, really every decision should be coming down to what would be the ideal, what would be the most natural way to navigate that situation, and then further refining based on the variables present, the factors present, what our aims and our goals are, what their comfort level is. Our birds being penned is a decision that's been completely driven by the very high number of aerial predators that we have in this area. So we simply we're in the desert, there's no shelter here. There's no sufficient cover here. They would be sitting ducks. And this is something that we hadn't really gotten a chance to think of since we weren't nearly as familiar with all of these things starting out. So all of these things are kind of a touch and go, do the best with what you're working with kind of situation, which is why knowing the details of the situation becomes so important. And when asking for help or input, recognizing that the people who are advising you only know the details you've provided and nothing more. So their advice can only be as good as the level of detail that they're working off of.
Right. So, we're all somewhere on a spectrum, between two extremes, the extreme of livestock keeping and the extreme of pet keeping. We all fall somewhere in the middle. And so we have to take every piece of advice with a grain of salt and really consider where we fall on that spectrum and what kind of, what level of advice we're trying to receive. And got to make sure to provide enough information, enough detail to get the answer we're hoping for.
Right, exactly. It's all going to be based on that. And it's not anything that people should be intimidated by or fearful of. So often I see people afraid to express their level of attachment or, feeling almost guilt tripped or peer pressured into neglecting it, which is always a weird one, when people are apologetic for having these feelings or apologetic for being sensitive.
Yeah, never be sorry for caring for another being. Like, never be sorry about that. That is, there's a reason you have a gut feeling about that kind of thing,
Right.
Not only, in the extreme of like culling a chicken, for food, but even just in the care you provide or the way that you manage behavior, something like pinning or kicking a rooster that's acting out. If you feel it in your gut that was wrong, if you feel a little guilty about that, there's a reason why, and you shouldn't you shouldn't shy away from that. You shouldn't second guess that. That is your instinct. That is the universe telling you, something was wrong.
Right. Well, and we see that a lot too, where people are, I guess, afraid of being too sensitive, afraid of being too nice. I've seen that cited. And my answer is always the same. There is no such thing as too nice. These are not animals that have to be molded into good beings. There's never going to be any danger in this. The only danger is going to be in removing yourself and distancing. That one actually can bring up problems. It can prevent you from noticing things that are very important to tend to and address. Just getting back to the mention of all of the very interesting things that we've seen that you might think a chicken doesn't need human intervention with, but they seemingly absolutely do. We think about this a lot because you see so often that people will suggest that chickens just kind of randomly get sick. They just randomly die. They randomly develop these crazy problems like nose abscesses or what have you. Given how much we have had to remove from nostrils on our flocks, only because we see it. We're close enough to them and we're around them enough that we notice these things. And when we see a giant plug of dirt and feed dust and feathers in their nose, we do something about it. But it's hard not to wonder how many of these just out of the blue, bad nose abscesses,
apparently for no reason.
Yeah, actually are because that chicken needed human intervention and they didn't get it. Same with the eye abscesses. How many people are checking for feathers behind their chicken's eyeball? And so sure, you cannot see that and you cannot intervene, but you can't guarantee that that's not going to develop into something problematic. There's actually quite a few things that human intervention can absolutely prevent and give them a much better outcome. So I've really become completely convinced these days that it's not at all accurate that chickens just randomly die. They only just randomly die if people are not being attentive, being involved, and they randomly die more the more distant and the more hands-off we are.
I mean, let's just be honest with ourselves. Do we actually think anyone or any living thing actually dies for literally no reason? I mean, there's such a thing as cause and effect, like in the simplest way. Right. There is no reason.
They never attack for no reason, and they never die for no reason either. No one ever has in the history of life. But it is common for keepers to never identify what it was. And, that factors back into this whole idea of the irresponsibility of such a large portion of the community just dismissing things as, oh, it's fine. And this will be even in the face of scientific evidence to the contrary. Oh, well, I've had my chicken for 8 years and I've never had a problem, so there's no harm here. And the question always has to be, have you taken them in for lab work? Have you done blood tests? Have you done x-rays? If they do die, apparently according to these people of old age, have you confirmed via a necropsy what the cause of death was and whether that thing you're saying was fine might have been involved? We all know that chickens hide signs of illness and injury, but then we take that and we're happy to run with it as evidence that the things that we're doing aren't having any negative effect. And so these two things, it can't be both. It can't be that chickens just die for no reason and that the things we're doing are completely safe. If the things we were doing were great, I imagine there'd be far fewer just sudden random losses. It seems much more logical to me to consider that there are, in fact, things that are either being done or that we're failing to do that are leading to problems. It may not be something we can pinpoint because we haven't made the connection, but that doesn't mean there's no connection there.
Yeah. And, you got to reiterate, too, that most people aren't even trying to, achieve a full lifespan for their chickens. So they're really just never even getting to see those long-term ill effects.
Right. That's another consideration, predation, all of these things that wind up taking them before they actually get into old age.
Well, and so that makes the sample set incredibly small. Anyone who does say, oh, I've had my chicken, for 8 years or for 10 years and I've had no problems doing this, they're 1 in a million, that have had a chicken live for 8 years when doing, maybe something that's less than ideal.
Oftentimes people will say, oh, I had no issues when I did this, and you ask for more information, well, how do you still have the boy? Still no issues? Anything you could possibly connect to? And they go, oh, well, he was, taken by a predator, or he died defending his flock when he was 3. Mm-hmm. It's like, this is not sufficient evidence for this. I would like to see somebody, who's been doing, we could never be this person because we're in the pet category. We're going to err on the side of caution always when it comes to health. We're never going to subject them to something potentially harmful for the purpose of experimentation. But I would love to see, any one of those keepers who's got an older bird who has stuck with some of the questionable, guidance, feeding them layer feed, or, exposing them to blue coat, or even diatomaceous earth has risks of respiratory harm. Any of these things done over a long period of time, I would love to hear when that bird passes a full detailed necropsy on what's going on in there. I have yet to see anyone provide something like that. I have yet to see any level of evidence that strong to suggest that there really isn't any harm being done.
Yeah. And, it's a little out of place, but I think it's worth just throwing out there that the oldest recorded hen was 23 and a half years old when she died. 23 years old.
Which is much more in line with like the smaller parrots, like cockatiels and things.
If that chicken could live that long, then it should stand to reason that any chicken that lives, significantly fewer years, or, is that like probably had a problem.
Well, they are dying young, and part of that is nature of the environment that they're in. They are often accessible, at least to predators, whether that's getting into the coop and run somehow, or being out free ranging and having that danger there. Anytime that you have an animal that's housed basically in the elements, there's going to be a greater risk of that and a shortened lifespan to some extent. We've also, of course, got the breeding that comes into this, roosters with their weak hearts and many different breeds of hens being subject to reproductive issues. So there's a lot at play there. But there's, I'm certain, quite a few birds that could have had a longer life. And so that's the other consideration, is that when you take the advice of these people who, maybe they're deciding that 10 years is a ripe old age and they feel like everything went flawlessly and there were no problems, but we can never really go back and test. Might that bird have lived to be 16 or 20 or 23 and a half if different care had been used? We don't get the benefit of a second try to confirm. So unless the first try was an absolute train wreck, and that bird died at like 8 months old or something, odds are pretty good that people are going to report that from their perspective, everything worked out just fine. We're not comparing against what could have been or the possibilities there. We're just comparing against essentially the worst case scenario. So if we're just looking for the average, the norm, what's acceptable, then that may be perfectly fine. But if we're looking for the best possible outcome, that's when we really need to be asking a lot of questions. We really need to be broadening our perspective and be at least aware of all of the things that may not be being taken into consideration and that may need to be accounted for in moving forward with any kind of, diet, housing, treatment of injury or illness, any of these things.
And skeptical of, any advice that's given without asking those additional questions.
Right. I tell people all the time, don't even trust me. Like, I'm frequently going and trying to give a great amount of detail and support, to anything that I try to recommend that people do, and always asking as many questions about their unique circumstances as I can. But even so, I'm a stranger online at the end of the day. Take what I've said, take what I've suggested, and use that as a jumping off point to go and confirm, and make sure that I'm not overlooking anything. It's really one of these situations where the only way that you're really going to be fully in control and fully able to protect the well-being of the members of your flock is if you ensure that you are the one calling the shots. You can be informed by other people. You can entertain what other people suggest. That's never going to be a problem. But it should never just be taken at face value. There's just way too much of a difference in goals here, and there's way too much bad information out there. It is an absolute minefield. I personally would never be comfortable just running with anything that I came across in this hobby. It's that bad.
Definitely.
But I suppose, ultimately, the point of all of this, the main point of all of this is that it is a flexible and a varied relationship that people have with their chickens. And it's not anything inherent in the chickens themselves. These labels are nothing but a shorthand that we use to indicate how we view them. But the bird themselves, they're going to be the same in all circumstances, with the exception of their potential. That's really the main difference here, is that the birds that are given the opportunity to grow into that companion status, who are welcomed into that relationship, are going to fulfill that role in remarkable ways. And the birds that aren't doing it simply because they have not been given that invitation. It makes me think of a quote that I absolutely love and think is really applicable to this entire topic, by the author of The Little Prince, whose name I will butcher because it is French, but it's Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and he's a very insightful author in a lot of areas, specifically talks about love and the human condition and how we see our world. But this particular quote is, "A rock pile ceases to be a rock pile the moment a single man contemplates it, bearing within him the image of a cathedral." And I feel like this is exactly what's at play here too. Mm-hmm. What you see in these birds, what you see in the rooster in your yard, what you see in the hens in your flock is so much more limited by what you're able to imagine and what potential you're able to entertain than anything in them. The limitations are set by us and what we're willing to allow them to become.
Absolutely. They're capable of so much, and they're only limited by our view of them, by our expectations of them. So have high expectations.
Really, in all things, see those remarkable possibilities. It's the only way you're going to ever reach them. We aren't ever going to find what we don't believe exists. And so similarly, never feel ashamed of loving your flock. Never feel ashamed of being a pet chicken keeper. And by all means, do not fall for this nonsense that they didn't meet the criteria to be a pet animal. Truly never known a better companion in my life, and would highly encourage anybody who's up for something amazing to get out there and start seeing those chickens like your family dog. It will blow you away how much they're capable of.
Absolutely. Well, that about wraps it up for this week. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next week. Take care.
Good.
Okay.
Good.